So good morning, good late morning. Welcome everyone to the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University. My name is Alyssa Ayers and I'm Dean of the school, and I am so delighted to welcome everyone to this book launch for Inadvertent Expansion, How Peripheral Agents Change World Politics, uh, uh, by our own Dr. Nick Anderson. It's always wonderful to celebrate the publication of books by our faculty. And that's why we do that through the Elliott School Book Launch Series. And it's particularly special when it's an author's first monograph, as is the case today. I will give a brief introduction to Professor Anderson. He joined the Elliott School in 2019 as a pre-doctoral fellow in our Institute for Security and Conflict Studies. He then spent a couple additional years with us at the school as associate director of our MA in International Affairs degree program, while also serving as assistant professor of international affairs. I should note we greatly appreciate all that he did for the MAIA degree program operations. He is now assistant professor of political science and of international affairs, so still a very active member of our school community. His research encompasses great power politics, military intervention and territorial expansion, conventional military operations, and East Asian international relations. His expertise in these areas is evident throughout Inadvertent Expansion. As he recounts in his acknowledgments, the book is many years in the making. We may hear about those many years in his talk today. It began while he was a PhD student in Yale's Department of Political Science. And he speaks specifically about how the inspiration for this book started with 130 words in the late Professor Bob Jervis's book, System Effects. Nick talks about reading a 130 word section of this 300-page book. It began an intellectual and personal journey that leads him through various cities, libraries, university departments, academic conferences, and hundreds, if not thousands, of books, articles, and diplomatic documents. It sounds like the scholarly life. Today, we celebrate that journey and its culmination in this innovative and empirically rigorous book, one that makes great use of historical cases around the world. Inadvertent Expansion is true to its title. It investigates unauthorized and unintended territorial expansion. Part of what Nick reveals is that while such expansion has received little attention from scholars, nearly 25% of great power coercive territorial expansion since the 19th century has been the result of peripheral actors acquiring territory without the approval of central leadership. We're going to hear much more about that today. In examining cases across continents and centuries, Professor Anderson offers insights into why frontier actors launch unauthorized bids of expansion and why some, but not all leaders, ultimately accept such acquisitions. So this is a fresh look at the enduring dynamics of territorial expansion. Congratulations, Professor Anderson. Thanks to you all for joining us today, and we're really looking forward to hearing how the book came together and your description of its theory. Thank you so much, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Dean Ayers. It's great. Thanks everyone for being here. It's great to be with you. I'm excited to be talking about my book. I don't have all that much prepared on the process. It was like too traumatic. I don't want to go back there, but I'm happy to answer questions in the Q&A if people have them about the experience writing the book, researching it. So as you're surely all aware, the book is about inadvertent expansion. Just to define the kind of key concept, the core concept at the center of the book. I define inadvertent expansion as the coercive acquisition of foreign territory that is planned and executed by actors on the periphery without the necessary authorization from leaders in the capital. So frontier actors claiming territory without being ordered or being authorized to do so. Despite the great variety and value of the literature in IR on territorial expansion, there's been very, very, very little attention to this idea, this notion of inadvertent expansion. You'll find it in sort of the history of empire, particularly history of the British Empire, but effectively none in political science and IR literature. Much of the literature that does make arguments about territorial expansion focuses on leaders and the decisions that they make to acquire territory for strategic reasons, including sort of the gains from conquest to offensive advantages to their revisionist intentions. There's another literature that focuses on what you might call the sort of non-strategic drivers of expansion, things like domestic political institutions, leader psychology, nationalist myth making, and the like. Even this body of scholarship focuses on leaders and their decisions to acquire territory. The problem is that, as I show in the book, territorial expansion is frequently initiated by these actors on the periphery without authorization. So, for instance, when Russia acquires the Khanate of Kokand, that's contemporary Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, in the mid-19th century, it's at the initiative of a lieutenant colonel in the Imperial Russian Army, Mikhail Chernayev, not the Tsar Alexander II. When Germany acquires East Africa in the late 19th century, it's at the initiative of a explorer and history and philosophy PhD student by the name of Karl Peters, not the Iron Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. And when Japan acquires Manchuria in the early 1930s, it's at the initiative of a mid-ranking officer in the colonial Kwantung Army, Shiwada Kanji, not the prime minister at the time. Cases like these, which I refer to as inadvertent expansion, have been very common throughout history. As Jean Eyre said, as many as 1 in 4 cases of great power territorial expansion are inadvertent in nature. So this is a global general phenomenon that we in international relations know very, very little about. So the question that I ask in the book and try and answer is what explains inadvertent expansion. To give you a preview of the argument, I argue it's a function of 2 key factors. The first is when leaders have relatively low control over their agents on the periphery. And the second is when there's relatively limited geopolitical risk associated with. So the 2 key factors are control. For the rest of the presentation, I'll talk about the theory, show you some of the quantitative evidence that's in the book. We'll take you through a little bit of the qualitative case study evidence, and then I'll close with a discussion of contemporary relevance. So despite the sort of variety of locations and time periods and actors that are involved, the process of inadvertent expansion, as I understand it, occurs in 2 basic steps. The first is what I refer to as peripheral expansion. What happens at this stage is that agents on the frontier go off and conquer or annex foreign territory without the authorization to do so. And then, once they've partially or wholly acquired this territory, they turn around and present leaders in the capital with it as a fait accompli. The picture here is one of those cases. It's from the cover of the book. It's in many ways seen as kind of the paradigmatic case of inadvertent expansion. The British in Sindh province in what's now Pakistan. So as I presented earlier, this first step is all about kind of control over the periphery. That's what explains when these actors do and don't engage in this peripheral expansion. So when such control is when the control that leaders have over these actors on the periphery is relatively low, you're more likely to get peripheral expansion. When control by leaders in the capital over their agents on the periphery is relatively high, you're much less likely to get. So that's step 1. The second step is what I refer to as central authorization. So these actors on the frontier have gone off, claimed foreign territory. They've turned around and presented leaders in the capital, their superiors, with this territory as a fait accompli. And the leaders now have a decision to make. Do they accept or do they reject the fait accompli that's been presented by these actors on the periphery? This is what I refer to as central authorization. This is a picture from the Monroe cabinet who had this problem in Florida, as we'll see a little bit later on. Before they can make this decision, it's important to note that the very act of peripheral expansion by these actors changes the facts on the ground and alters the strategic calculus that faces these leaders in the capital. It places a set of constraints on them that makes it hard for them to kind of turn the territory away easily and let it go. And it does so for 3 basic reasons. First is that peripheral expansion, these peripheral claims, sink the costs of territorial acquisition. By this, I mean that they expend, state or imperial resources, sometimes blood and treasure, to acquire territory, and that cost can't be easily recovered. So it's already been spent, and therefore the leaders see kind of turning the territory back as a missed opportunity and often a wasted one. So this sort of pushes leaders towards saying yes. Second is domestic political pressure that can emerge in certain cases. So often these actors on the frontier have the ability to gin up domestic political support for what's happening on the frontier, and they can get the public to rally around them and put pressure on leaders in the capital. to accept what they've done. In some cases, these pressures are incredibly severe. So in the case of Japan and Manchuria, which is one of the case studies in the book, um, leaders are faced with coup attempts, assassination attempts, the emergence of ultra-nationalist organizations. A prime minister is actually assassinated over what's happening in Manchuria. So very, very severe pressures, very, very hard to say no under some of these conditions. Third is the engagement of national honor. So once these actors on the frontier got off and claimed territory, leaders in the capital frequently find that backing down and turning it back would be an unacceptably costly stain on the national honor. And for that reason, they feel as though it's difficult to let it go. So an example that I draw on in the theory chapter of the book is from Russia in the Amur province in the mid 19th century, and this frontier actor claims that part of what was then China. And the Tsar, when he finds out what's happening, says, "Where once the Russian flag has been raised, never shall it be lowered." So this idea that like feels from a perspective of honor or prestige difficult to withdraw. That said, I mean, there are cases in which they don't retain the territory. They have that ability. And so the question is, under what conditions do they accept and reject given these constraints? And I argue that this is all about the geopolitical risk associated with acquiring that territory. So when the risk associated with this territorial acquisition is relatively low, you're more likely to get central authorization and therefore expansion. When the risk is relatively high, you're much less likely. They're more likely to turn it back and say, we're not going to take this and reject it. So just to sum up the theory in its entirety, inadvertent expansion occurs in two basic steps: peripheral expansion and central authorization. I've argued that control over the periphery is the most important determinant of peripheral expansion. When it's relatively low, you're more likely to get that. When it's high, you're much less likely to see peripheral expansion occur. Once these actors on the frontier have gone off and claimed this territory, they sort of change the facts on the ground and put constraints on the leaders of the capital as a result of sunk costs, domestic political pressure, and engaged national honor. However, they still have a decision to make, and when they make this decision, the most important factor weighing on their minds is the geopolitical risk associated with acquiring the territory. When the risk is seen as unacceptably high, they're likely to reject the fait accompli and turn the territory back despite these constraints and these potential costs. However, once when they determine that it's acceptably low, they're willing to go and accept it. Okay, so that's the theory. The book has a couple of components. It's a mixed methods research design. It's got a chapter that focuses on quantitative methods, and I collected data for this. That's chapter 2, and then it has a series of qualitative historical case studies, which I'll talk about in a second. The quantitative component presents data that I collected for the book, all cases of great power territorial expansion from 1816 effectively to the present till 2014. There's 258 of these cases. And what I do is code each of these observations of expansion as to whether it was inadvertent or intentional in nature. So for each case in the data, I had to make a determination as to who was the actor who try and find out who ordered the instance of territorial expansion, or if I could find information on the instance of territorial expansion, or whether there's evidence that it was initiated from one of these peripheral actors. This was very hard, a very difficult piece of information to come up with in many cases. In some, it was obvious. In others, it took sort of, for a single instance out of the 258 observations, it would take sort of weeks to kind of come to a determination and reading of book chapters and whatnot. Anyway, I was able to do so in 251 out of the 258, and of those, a total of 55 or 22% I code as inadvertent. So in nearly a quarter of cases of territorial expansion by the great powers in the 19th and 20th centuries, you have a sharp disconnect between what the leaders in the capital intend and what the behavior of the state that they're apparently in charge of is doing. Here are those 55 cases. So as you can see, there's a wide variety of cases represented. So you've got 6 great powers, 6 of the 9 great powers that have experienced inadvertent expansion in all world regions with the exception of Europe. There's a wide variety of different kinds of territories that are acquired via inadvertent expansion. So you have sort of tiny islands in the South Pacific, like France acquiring Tahiti. You've got sort of large populous swaths of East Asia. So this would be Japan in Manchuria, where tens of millions of people lived. You've got some modern states that people will know of, Singapore, which was acquired by the British via inadvertent expansion. So lots of variety represented here. There's also lots of temporal variation. So these cases occur as early as 1818, as far as my coding goes, and as late as 1932. And it's just sort of, as you can see in the cases in black, it's a regular feature of great power politics throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. Okay, so you'll recall from the theory that I argue that when leaders in the capital have low control over their agents on the periphery, you're more likely to get inadvertent expansion. In order to get at this notion of control, what I did was collect data on the global telegraph network. It's hard to overstate the revolutionary impact of the telegraph on 19th century international relations. For the first time in human history, individuals were able to communicate across vast distances almost instantaneously. And this changes, basically everything from trade to diplomacy to how wars are conducted, and as you'll see, to territorial expansion and empire. So basically, before I get to that, what I did was try and determine in every instance of territorial expansion in the data, those 258 cases, whether the territory in question was connected to the global telegraph network at the time of acquisition. The idea being, if it was connected, this would give leaders in the great power capital the ability to monitor any of its personnel there and thereby potentially better control. So my expectation, to be clear, is when territorial expansion takes place onto territories that do have the telegraph, that expansion should be less likely to be inadvertent. And when it takes place onto territories that do not have the telegraph, that expansion should be more likely to be inadvertent. And that is what the data that I collected shows. So as you can see on the left-hand side, among all cases of territorial expansion by the great powers, where they are connected, where the territory in question is connected to the telegraph, roughly only 8% of those are inadvertent. In contrast, among all cases where there is not a connection to the telegraph, nearly 40% are inadvertent. And this relationship holds. I do a more formal analysis in the book, a linear probability analysis with a bunch of controls for sort of probable confounds, and the relationship is still highly significant. So there's clearly a relationship. You'll also recall from the theory that the second key factor is geopolitical risk. When geopolitical risk is relatively low, I expect inadvertent expansion to be more likely. In this case, what I did was code every observation of territorial expansion as to the risk, the sort of geopolitical risk associated with that acquisition, based on things like, was the territory a great power's territory? Was it the neighbor of a great power? Was it one of their colonies? Was it allied to a great power? And so, coded each one, and that should be sort of the basis for that comparison. As a reminder, my expectation here is that when there is geopolitical risk, the expansion that you observe in that case should be less likely to be inadvertent. When there's not geopolitical risk, the expansion you observe in that case is more likely to be inadvertent. And again, this is what the data show. So in all cases of expansion that I code as risky, roughly only 9% are inadvertent. In contrast, among all cases that I code as sort of less risky or non-risky, none of them are non-risky, but less risky, over 30%. And this is also in that more formal analysis, also has all of the controls still. So that is the quantitative component. It took a lot of time, but ends up being sort of a small part of the book. It's just confined to one chapter. The rest of the book and sort of the bulk of the book is a series of qualitative historical case studies that make up chapters 3 through 7, sort of for sure the largest kind of page and word count. When I was picking cases, I had a couple of kind of considerations in mind. The first was that I wanted to sort of show the generalizability of the theory across a variety of different cases. And so I have all of the great powers who experience inadvertent expansion included, with the exception of the UK. I have a wide variety of time periods, as early as 1818 in Florida, as late as 1932 in Japan. Different regime types are represented, sort of democracies and authoritarian regimes experiencing this. States at different levels of relative power experiencing this. So, Italy, sort of barely great Italy, and Germany, in the late 19th century at the sort of peak of its power. So lots of variety there, and sort of all experiencing very similar things. The other sort of consideration I had was to try and have close comparability within chapters. So across chapters, I wanted them to be sort of varied to show generalizability. Within each chapter, I chose the cases sort of specifically for their comparability to sort of strengthen inference in each case. So in effectively all of these cases, with the exception of six, in the case of all these chapters, with the exception of six, it's the same great power operating in the same region in roughly the same time period, and seeing divergent outcomes for reasons of geopolitical risk. The plus means they actually acquired the territory. The minus means they did not, and that's sort of how these chapters break. So I'm going to highlight a few of the cases just to give you a sense of kind of what's in them, and what you might find kind of interesting. What I found interesting in researching them, writing about them. The first is the two U.S. cases. So this is the U.S.'s acquisition of Florida in 1819, and its failure or decision not to acquire Texas in 1836. So this is clearly the same great power operating in the same region, separated by only 20 years or so. What's noteworthy in this case is that it's the very same actor who is the frontier agent in the first case of Florida and the leader in the capital, the U.S. president in 1836. Does anybody know who this is? You can shout it out. Any guesses?
Donald Trump's favorite.
Donald Trump's favorite, yeah. Andrew Jackson is so it's the case of the two Andrew Jacksons across these two cases. So in Florida, he's the commander of the southern forces of the U.S. Army. He's president by they have not before 1936. When he has, as the frontier, as the commander of the southern district of the U.S. Army, he writes a letter to James Monroe in January 1818 and says the whole of East Florida should be seized. Very sort of aggressive approach, and ultimately he's not given permission to do so, but does it anyway. Goes off, claims the territory, and is able to convince the Monroe administration in Washington that they should keep the territory, and succeeds in doing so. Fast forward, roughly 20 years, and he has a similar opportunity by someone just like him who was doing something quite similar in Texas. They have an opportunity to acquire the newly independent Republic of Texas in 1836 after the Revolution. And his comment at the time as president is, it was a rash and premature act. And he decides to sort of turn the territory away for, out of concern for war with Mexico, among other reasons, but importantly out of concern for Mexico. So, the hot-blooded commander becomes the sort of cool-headed, rational statesman. Anyway, it's just sort of neat to see this process play out with the very same person across the two cases. Another, I think, very interesting sort of striking case is France in Tonkin. This is the same, clearly the same great power operating in the same region. In this case, it's actually the very same specific piece of territory that's being claimed. What's noteworthy about the case is it's like the similarities kind of go beyond these. So what you have are two French naval officers who follow an incredibly similar process. Both sort of ignore the orders of their superiors in Paris, claim the very same territory, ultimately are killed in the process of trying to claim these territories. In fact, as you can see in one of these pictures, decapitated. Both of them were decapitated across the two cases. And in one case, France acquires the territory. In the first case, France refrains from acquiring the territory. In the second case, it does. So the thing that's sort of striking about this, pair of cases, that is how similar they are. I felt, very fortunate to have sort of stumbled across this. History very rarely repeats itself in the way that it does in this chapter. In these cases. Last one I'll highlight is Germany and East Africa. There's a couple of reasons why I think this is interesting. First, it's Germany operating in the same region, separated by only 5 years. The other thing that's neat is that the peripheral actor is the same person across the two cases. So it's the same person who succeeds in persuading the leaders in the capital to acquire East Africa in 1885, but fails in 1890 in Uganda. The other thing that's noteworthy about the case is the leaders who are involved in the capital. So it's, Bismarck, the sort of famously reluctant imperialist in 1885, who agrees to acquire this territory. He's famous for saying all this colonial business is a sham. But he agrees for sort of reasons of domestic political pressure. And then it's Kaiser Wilhelm II, who, the kind of young nationalist who wanted Germany's place in the sun. He decides to turn away this opportunity to acquire Uganda in 1890. The other thing that's kind of neat about the cases is that Bismarck is actually dismissed halfway through the process of inadvertent expansion in the second case. So you can see these kind of two leaders with very different orientations, seeing the problem very similarly. They both agree that Germany should not acquire Uganda, and so that's kind of a nice comparison case. Okay, before I get to contemporary implications, I just want to give a little bit more kind of detail on the kind of stuff, the kind of evidence that I use to support the arguments and the stuff that you would see in these chapters. So I'm not going to take you through a case, just like little bits of evidence from a variety of different cases. So there's lots of evidence in the book for leaders kind of having limited control over their actors on the frontier. This is the Japanese prime minister in the case of Manchuria in 1932. And he says, I'm quite powerless to restrain the military. How can His Majesty's military act without a sanction? What can I do? So a feeling of sort of a total loss of control, in this case, among many others. There's also lots of evidence of these actors going off and claiming territory in their own responsibility, on their own authority. In the case of Russia in the Khanate of Kokand, Mikhail Chernayev just sort of declares that this is what he's doing, and he writes to St. Petersburg and says, "I've decided to conquer Kent at my own responsibility," and he goes off and does it, and ends up having. There's evidence of sort of sunk costs and of this idea that, sort of once these actors on the frontier claim territory, it sort of changes the facts on the ground, makes leaders think about it differently, and makes them kind of reluctant to turn it away, come up with arguments for retaining it. So here's Monroe in the case of Florida. He notes that recent events in Florida show the incompetency of Spain to maintain our authority there, and Jackson's action will furnish a strong inducement in Spain to cede the territories. Evidence that the action itself that Jackson engaged in is part of what's sort of shaping. There's lots of evidence of domestic political pressure operating on these leaders. So here's a quote from Bismarck in the case of East Africa, and he says, "For reasons of domestic policy, the colonial is vital. At present, public opinion emphasizes colonial policy so strongly in Germany that the position of the government within Germany largely depends on it for its success." So lots of important pressure there. In the case of Russia and Kokand, you can see evidence of engaged national honor operating on these leaders, this kind of force that binds their hands to some extent. So the war minister, Dmitry Milyutin, after Mikhail Chernayev goes off and claims, the Khanate in the mid-19th century, he says the dignity of the empire and the interests of Russia do not allow us to consider the possibility of retreat. Our whole future in Central Asia. This idea that prestige is operating and honor concerns are operating on these leaders. There's evidence of leaders agreeing to acquire territories for reasons of relatively low risk. So in the case of France and Tonkin, the later case, the foreign minister says the concern was that there may be a conflict with China over northern Vietnam, and the French foreign minister kind of bats away these kind of concerns, saying the Chinese will be careful not to declare war because peace is too advantageous for them. Their forces on land and sea are singularly overrated. They're poorly armed. Most of them are undisciplined. He would turn out to be wrong in this case, and this is the beginning of the Sino-French War, but that was what was going on in the minds of these leaders when they were making their decisions. Finally, there's evidence of relatively high risk making leaders reluctant to engage to acquire the territory that's been presented to them. So again, in the case of Russia, this time in the Ely region in the 1870s, he says the war minister says war with China would be a misfortune without any possible compensation. It's absolutely necessary to avoid it, and on that basis, they turn. So that's a sense of kind of what's in the qualitative case studies. To sum up, the question that the book asks is what explains inadvertent expansion in world politics. This is expansion that's executed by actors on the periphery without authorization from their leaders in the capital. I've argued that it's a combination of low geopolitical risk and low control over the periphery that makes this most likely. Leaders in this process are constrained by sunk cost domestic political pressure and concerns over national honor. And it's common. It occurs in roughly 1 in 4 cases over the past couple hundred years. And I've presented quantitative and qualitative case study evidence that's in abundance in the book. So it's largely a book of historical international relations, but there are points of contemporary relevance that I think are worth drawing out that are, given attention in the conclusion. First is the role that inadvertent expansion may have played in the broader decline in large-scale territorial conquest. So it's sort of like a well-known research finding in international relations scholarship that conquest has become much less common, particularly among the most powerful states in the international system, the great powers, sort of claiming large pieces of territory. There's lots of things that have contributed to this decline in the incidence of conquest, nuclear weapons, economic globalization, maybe the emergence of a territorial integrity norm and the force of international law. These are kind of arguments that here. I think it's hard to know the extent to which it played a role, but I think it's probably unlikely that the sort of decline of inadvertent expansion, this kind of regular path to territorial expansion, disappears on its own with the emergence of kind of improved global communications technology. One kind of common path to the acquisition of territory is effectively ruled out, not exactly, but largely ruled out for these great powers by this, and I think that probably played some role among these other forces in kind of shaping the world as it is today. Second is that inadvertent expansion hasn't entirely disappeared. You still see examples of attempted kind of conquest by small states, by relatively weak states in developing world contexts where they have sort of pathological civil military relations. According to data collected by Dan Altman and Melissa Lee, roughly 1 in 5 conquest attempts since 1950 have been militaries acting without orders to do so. So it may still go on at a smaller scale in kind of developing world contexts. Maybe less likely to be successful now, but the attempts are still there. The last thing I'll say is that the kind of ideas that define the theory and the sort of notions behind it have relevance for other things in contemporary great power politics, especially in how the great powers use proxy forces. So, we've all heard a lot about Russia's private military companies in the past few years, the sort of now largely defunct, I guess, Wagner Group, but they've been all over lots of regions of the world, engaging in activity for Russia. You've got China and the maritime militia in places like the South China Sea, and while I haven't seen evidence that these actors are sort of going off and claiming territory on behalf of these states, many of these kind of pathologies of control and domestic political pressure and concerns about nationalism, there's no reason why they wouldn't operate in these cases. One example that I think is pretty interesting that gets an extended treatment in the conclusion is the origins of the Donbass War. What happens in this case is, Russia claims Crimea in February, I think, between sort of February and March 2014. And in the kind of, as all of this is going on, this guy, Igor Girkin, pictured here, crosses the border in April 2014 into Eastern Ukraine, sort of hooks up with anti-Russian separatist forces in Donetsk and Luhansk. By May 2014, they declare independence. They've kind of claimed some armories and police stations and sort of, taken control locally. Things start to heat up and a sort of insurgency starts to kind of boil up. And this leads Russia in August 2014 to deploy 5,000 forces. And as we know, they've effectively been there ever since. There's evidence from people who have looked carefully at this case that Girkin was effectively engaging in cross the border and linked up with these forces without the authority from Moscow to do so. So as Mark Galeotti in his book on the Putin's Wars says, Girkin was acting not just without orders, but seemingly against them. Anna Arutunian, a great journalist, says there's strong evidence to suggest that in invading the Donbass, Girkin was defying orders, not carrying out. So at least people who are looking carefully at this think this is part of what may be going on. Galeotti continues, this was not coordinated, nor was it necessarily pro-Moscow, and the Kremlin was uncertain whether it actually wanted to be involved. And he continues, nevertheless, a sense grew in Moscow that this rising or uprising could not be allowed to fail, not least to avoid nationalist protest at home. And it also offered an opportunity. So a lot of the dynamics that are being described here sort of overlap with arguments made here. Arutunian, in reflecting on the same event, says Putin felt he was in a bind. If he launched a full-blown military intervention, he would trigger a tougher Western response. However, if he backed down, he would show weakness to the Americans and to his own nationalists. And this is, this kind of bind that Putin is described as being in, would be very familiar to, leaders going back a couple hundred years, from James Monroe to Otto von Bismarck. Anyway, that is the presentation. Book is now available from Cornell University Press. You can get it on Amazon, obviously. If you would like this, there's a code there. You can get a discount on the book if you're going to purchase it. And yeah, I'm happy to take people's questions.
He has a mic and we'll be walking around.
Congrats again on the book. I have two questions. How do you define, and forgive me, I couldn't see it in the presentation. How do you define peripheral actors? You have the central actors, and how do you define the peripheral? And second, I understand that the focus and the scope of your book is on great powers, but can you apply your theory to non-great powers?
Yeah, thank you. Good thoughts. So the peripheral actors are effectively anyone who works for the state, exists on the periphery of the state or empire, so is like sort of in one of these locales, either at the edge of the state or abroad in a frontier territory. I meant to say this, I didn't say this. Most frequently they are members of the military, members, diplomats if it's sort of annexation, colonial administrators, sometimes kind of non-state actors, but nationals of the country. So like explorers or other economic actors. But that's basically it. It's like a person who's out there on the frontier. So that's one. In terms of non-state, non-great powers. I mean, yeah, I showed the data from Lee and Altman, who've looked a little bit at similar stuff for sort of smaller states. I think you could. I think there's no reason why you couldn't apply the thinking and the theory to non-great powers. I think I would imagine it would apply similarly. One reason to look at the great powers is they do so much of the territorial expansion that like it's a big chunk of the evidence. But it would be interesting to see how and if it applies to smaller states. I suspect it does, but I can't.
Hey, this is a fantastic book. I remember your article version back in ISCS when I was a pre-doc a long time ago, so it's really cool to see you presenting it now. So I have two questions. One of them is about what causes low control of the periphery and whether that's something that great powers might choose to deliberately price in places where there might be lower geopolitical risk. So do you view the low control as the factor all the way to the left in your causal chain, or is something else driving that? For instance, maybe a great power says, I don't really trust this peripheral agent, but I'm not so worried about what they might do over there because what's the worst that could happen? A little extra conquest? Sure, fine. And so lets them kind of decides to give them some more free reign and not to monitor them as closely, which is another way of saying, is some of this inadvertent expansion a little bit more advertent in terms of the choices that the capitals might be making? And my second question is sort of about how either your deduction or your research led you to think about what control is exactly. And in your story, it's really comms. It's the telegraph. It's the ability to sort of see what they're doing, communicate with them. But if we're kind of just broadening the lens to civil military relations and when do military agents ever disobey or take initiative beyond beyond the direction of the civilian principle of civ mil as a principal agent problem. There are a whole bunch of reasons why military agents do things that the civilians don't sanction. And so I wonder what led you to land on the comms piece as the critical piece, as opposed to, things like the popularity of the military, letting it feel like it can do whatever it wants, and so just all the other things that could drive military agents to kind of just go off on their own volition.
Yeah, good, thank you. So on the first question, it's definitely the case that it's difficult to disentangle things like where the telegraph ends up and sort of geopolitical risk. They're deeply intertwined. So for example, the telegraph is born, not mistaken, sort of simultaneously in the United States and in Europe, in like Central Europe, like the first telegraph lines. And it spreads quickly in Europe. So like all these powerful states in Europe are really well connected very quickly once the invention occurs. And it takes sort of forever for it to get to some, like the interior of Africa, we're talking like early 20th century. It takes like 70, 67 years in some of these cases. So the places that you're like, great power rivals, you'll be connected very quickly. So there's this kind of motive to like have that communication, have that potentially that control. So it's hard to separate the two. For sure, that's true. In terms of like to what extent leaders are not sort of choosing not to monitor certain frontiers and peripheries. I mean, I think there's probably something to that. If I saw sort of strong evidence that that they were sort of saying like, let's see what he can get, I would have. I mean, I didn't see cases like that. I would have had to think hard about whether that counts as inadvertent expansion. I think it veers towards not counting. I would have sort of said, oh, it seems like they're trying to get that territory. Yeah. So the main thing I will say though is like my sense is that these leaders in the capital are in charge of and in control of and trying to like track like 800 things at once, and they simply don't have that kind of like they're not paying attention to what's going on in Russian Turkestan, in St. Petersburg, like not paying close attention on a daily basis, like what's happening on that frontier. It's just like these things spring into their laps, and it's like, oh my God, another headache to kind of deal with. That's the overwhelming response is like surprise and dismay, and usually like anger, as opposed to it being this kind of like this great thing. So that's what I would say that like often they've got so many peripheries and so many agents that whatever any one of them is doing is kind of like not something that they keep track of. The second, your second question was,
It's most.
one word reminder.
Yeah, sure. Why would a military agent
Oh, yeah.
ever defy?
Yeah, yeah. Yes.
Explanation is, the principal doesn't have the monitoring ability, which is, I'm using jargon, but
Yeah.
that's where kind of the telegram would come in. But, there are of course lots of other reasons why military agents might do things that their overseers don't want them to do. So
yeah, and
you can focus on that.
Yeah, thank you. Great. So I have cases in the book. The Japan and Italy cases both have telegraph connections, so it's not like this pure kind of relationship between kind of your ability to communicate with them and inability to control or ability to control. And those are both kind of weak civil military relations kind of cases. The real reason I focused on so first in kind of classic principal agent theory, like it's all about monitoring, and I thought this is like the closest thing they had to kind of monitoring from a distance in a lot of these cases in the 19th century. The second thing is that there just isn't norms of civil military relations change a lot. Like it's a meaningless, not totally meaningless, but sort of a meaningless concept in the 19th century. It really becomes an important, meaningful concept in the 20th century. So it's an important driver in two and more, I think, of my cases. Yeah, in the data, there's other cases where it's like this is a question of civil military relations, a question of monitoring and control. There's also a convenience question, like the telegraph in terms of measuring is like a kind of 1-0 thing. Either you are connected or you're not. Whereas like civil military relations is very fuzzy and kind of hard to code across cases. So I think those are the yes.
Hi, Nick. Thanks so much. And I'm so excited to see this in print. Same as Rachel, I've seen this multiple version of this before. So very excited. And I'll definitely buy with a 30% discount. I have one question. I'm just curious about your thought on your research on how the frontier actors being treated in as a result of conquesting territory without authorizations. Are they being dismissed, punished, or get rewarded? If punished, why not less? If get rewarded, why not more? So I want to hear more about your thought on that in the process of central authorization. How the decisions being made about the frontier actors.
Yeah, such an interesting part of the story. I think the example of Andrew Jackson is such a good one. He becomes president of the United States. Like you can't rise to a higher station in America. And that was like one of the things he was famous. There are other things he was famous for, but this is one of the things he was very famous for, and it made him a national hero. And I think I forget how I put it in the book, but I think I made say something like future president was born with this kind of case. So actually, across cases, what you see is rewards for these actors. My kind of theory about this is that they become very popular politically. Um, it's seen as costly to overly kind of punish them. So these, guys in the Kwantung Army in Japan who were involved in acquiring Manchuria, they rise through the ranks. One of them becomes defense minister, and this is very, very common. They're rewarded. They're not only not punished, they're generally rewarded for what they do. I mean, in the moment, the leaders are angry and discouraged, but they feel bound to effectively reward. So that's kind of the. Thank you, Henry.
Yeah, thank you. A really great contribution. I just had kind of two questions, maybe interrelated. The first was kind of along the lines of Rachel's, and I just wonder how you, think maybe you could talk a little bit more about the nature or kind of just what the concept of inadvertence is, because like a lot of the cases are in the context of expansionist agendas, that are going on, kind of prevalent discourses, and just, maybe in individual cases, like the leaders weren't for it or against it. And I guess the second question is, I wonder, do you find an informational story anywhere? Because like the Telegraph, it's a mechanism of control, but it's also, in monitoring, right? But the information isn't necessarily only about monitoring. And so I wonder, for example, one might expect people kind of on the site, on the ground, right, to have better information about what the opportunities really are, and maybe to see the weaknesses, in which case that might lead them to go ahead and take the opportunity that they see, and they think, well, the leadership just doesn't know what they're doing. After the Telegraph comes, then you would expect less information asymmetry, in which case then, maybe leaders would be more likely to support the initiatives when the opportunities are there, but less likely to have disagreement, that would lead to kind of the unintentional, so they'd be able to restrain it just because there isn't the informational asymmetry. So I wonder, is that part of the story?
Yeah, thank you. On the first question, so I define it fairly strictly, which is like, so in each case in the data, I would go through and say, okay, I need to find out like who ordered this case of territorial expansion and when did they order it. In most cases of inadvertent sort of expansion, in some cases there's, as you say, sort of interest in acquiring the territory. So I think there was a feeling in the United States that Florida would someday be part of America among at least some of the leaders. There was no guarantee that this would actually happen, but I think they sort of felt that way. Jackson, his conquest of Florida was kind of like not, they didn't want him to do it then, but they might have been kind of happy if it happened at some point. But I still, because he wasn't specifically ordered to do so, they didn't kind of intend for that to occur at that time. Sort of, I call it inadvertent, and that's what that's my kind of procedure across cases. So, who gave the order for that, instance to take place? I had to sort of find lots of evidence that like there was not an order, that there was not an intention that like the territory to be counted. But I agree that like there's a lot of gray for sure in some of these cases, and it is like the race for empire in Africa. You see ends up seeing lots of cases of inadvertent expansion, and I guess they're sort of in some cases kind of okay to take the territory, but they as long as they didn't order it, that's how I think about it. Yeah, the information point is a good one. It is sort of part of like how I broadly think about principal agent dynamics, that asymmetries of information and divergent preferences is what drives these things. So you have to have one party knows a lot more about what's going on than the other, and they have different like preferences for what to do next. That's like what drives principal agent problems. Yeah, I think it is correct that you do see evidence of kind of what you're describing, where these actors know. So if you're on the frontier in Central Asia and in St. Petersburg is the capital in the mid 19th century, like it's a 4-month kind of turnaround to get communications back and forth, sort of 2 months each way, because they're traveling by horseback. Like this is pre-rail, in some of these cases, or they don't have like rail to the frontier. So it is the case that these actors on the frontier are like, well, yes, there's an opportunity. I'm going to just take it because I can't ask for permission. Even still, like again, according to my coding scheme, that counts. And even still, in those cases, you do see leaders in Moscow or in St. Petersburg saying like sure, like we may have wanted this, but not now, not in this way. Thanks. Seniors.
Thank you so much. And as I said to Nick earlier, it's great to see the relevance of the historical cases to thinking about this question, theorizing this question. I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about how you identify a greater versus less geopolitical risk. How do you think about that as leading to acceptance of territorial expansion versus not? And how should we think about the idea of geopolitical risk for contemporary application?
Yeah.
I imagine that's probably pretty relevant.
Yeah, for sure. So the way I, strictly the way I kind of did it in the kind of case study, or sorry, the quantitative research was for each instance of territorial expansion of data. The questions were, I'm probably going to get them right. Is the territory that of another great power? Is it territory adjacent to another great power? So like it's a buffer state between you and another great power. Is it territory of a state or actor that's allied with another great power? And then I think I had a category for what I called major powers. So these are like powerful states, but that we don't consider to be great powers at the time. So Turkey, Mexico, China in the 19th century, like, sort of states you don't want to end up in a war with halfway across the world. And that's kind of like that was the logic behind it, that, the leaders in the capital didn't choose to acquire these territories, and therefore they're much less willing to go to war effectively over them. They're much less willing to pay significant costs over acquiring them. If they had I mean, we know that leaders go to war for territory over the course of, history all the time, and they're willing to pay at, enormous costs to do so. But because in this case it's like out of their control, they're more reluctant, and that's why I think geopolitical risk plays this important, where it's like when it's, easy in the sense of not going to be like super costly, they're more likely to say, okay, sure, like because of these constraints that I'm operating under, domestic, political, or sort of honor constraints, sure, like I'll take the territory. But when it is very costly, they're much less likely, I think. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, for sure, it matters. Like, thinking about the geopolitical risk associated with acquiring territory matters a lot. I guess how would I think about, the case that I ended on with the war in the Donbass? Let's just say this is like a case of inadvertent expansion, and Girkin is our frontier agent. I mean, Ukraine is a pretty, one of the largest states in Europe, so a pretty powerful state. So it's a little unexpected that kind of Moscow stuck with it, although I guess they had already claimed Crimea, so they were sort of halfway in already. Yeah, I'm sort of trying to, anyway, yeah. So I would say there isn't a great power on the other side of Ukraine. Like, it's not like, this is, although there are American allies. Anyway, yeah, it's an interesting question. I haven't sort of, yeah. Thank you.
Congratulations. I have two comments and a question. The first comment is that I think your explanatory framework is brilliant. And, in the ISCS workshops this year, we've read a lot of papers. These are research projects that are in progress, but there've been many cases where the explanatory frameworks were just way too elaborate, implausibly elaborate. Decision makers do not go through that kind of process. And I think your framework gets it just right. I mean, it's like Goldilocks. It's not too much, it's not too little. It's systematic, it's logical, and it's compelling. And I think, as my British colleagues would say, it's spot on. Second comment just has to do with the current relevance, and you mentioned the Donbass case as a possible case of inadvertent expansion. in the current era. You didn't mention Crimea, and as I recall, that was annexed in about a month. And I think the conventional wisdom there is that was entirely intentional and top down.
Yeah.
And so what you're saying is that there are actors in Russia with respect to the Donbass who are more aggressive and expansionistic than Vladimir Putin. So thanks for sharing that. I mean, it's like, but also it's good to know. I mean, I always thought of the Donbass and Eastern Ukraine as top down and more complicated than that. So I'll give that more thought. My question just has to do with current relevance, and I'm looking at your book cover, and I'm imagining your second book, Intentional Expansion, How Predatory States Shape World Politics in the 21st Century, Nicholas D. Anderson. And one of the things that struck me about your presentation and your argument is that there are many cases where leaders in the center go back and forth and they're thinking very carefully about, should I stay or should I go? And, thinking about the present era at the state level, obviously China, Taiwan, Russia's kind of preoccupied, Trump and Greenland. I mean, are there any lessons from your analysis that might give us some insights into, let's say, Beijing or Trump and Greenland and what their thinking might be and the factors that might lead them to push forward as opposed to hold back?
Yeah. So in terms of stuff, I mean, the one thing I would say, the thing I'll always be sensitive to after reading and researching, preparing this book, researching and writing this book is that leaders are less in control than we think. Not always, clearly it's 1 in 4 cases, not sort of 3 in 4 cases. So, but I am sensitive to that. So whenever things happen now, I'm kind of constantly attuned to the idea that how much, do we know for a fact that this was centrally directed? Do we know that this didn't kind of bubble up on the periphery somehow? So, I think that's a relevant way of looking at the world, just to have that as a possibility in the back of one's mind when they read the newspaper. I think that part of it is relevant. I don't know if it has much to tell us about, what might happen between China and Taiwan. Clearly, so there's been this larger scale decline of possible territorial incorporation for lots of reasons. And the ones that I find most compelling are economics, like you can trade and invest and get what you used to get out of occupying other countries. And like the costs associated with doing so, nationalism, nuclear war, and things that might happen if you go off and take big bites out of other countries. And we're seeing it in Russia, right? Like this extraordinarily costly decision that they made starting in 2014, really in 20. Nothing like it since the Second World War. So it's not going well for them. I think that weighs on the minds of leaders in other capitals, including this one. That it's not going to be as easy as you might. But yeah, I think the theory more broadly doesn't have as much to say about that. I think, broader literature on expansion does, but not so much.
So Nick, many congratulations on the book. When you were a pre-doc, I remember you coming along to Just Write and bringing like 10 books with you and sitting behind this wall of information and getting through it. So yeah. Bravo for getting through it. So I want to ask you a question I asked you some years ago at an ISCS seminar when you presented. And I'm just wondering how you've been thinking about this, because I still wonder what the impact of the way the territory was acquired is for how much the great power wants to defend it afterwards. And maybe you want to answer it through the lens of honor and how that plays in, but I'd be really interested in your thoughts.
Yeah. I think I haven't developed my thoughts as much as I would like since, whenever that, I remember talking about it with you, and my thoughts haven't developed as much as I would have liked. I guess I would say that I would expect leaders who engage in kind of intentional expansion to be more likely to kind of cling to the territory, kind of to the death, so to speak. And you just see cases like this: Japan's invasion of China in 1937, and that's the end of the job, beginning of the end of the job. And I think sort of Russia's invasion of Ukraine today, that when it's clear that a top-down decision was made, when things start to go poorly, it may be harder to kind of pull back. So I think that is how I would kind of that inadvertent expansion, despite these constraints that show up in sort of historical cases, still probably a little easier to kind of cut than when you've made the decision and it starts to go. We're out of time, but my next book is on military intervention and why some interventions end up being so much longer and costlier than others. Why, when leaders decide to send military forces to other countries and it goes badly, why they can't pull back. So I hope to have a good answer to your question, to this question in like 2 years. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate it.